Zero RB has been around for more than a decade now. The original Zero Running Back article, 2013. So I thought it was about the perfect time, especially a little dead zone of the best ball season, to dive in to kind of a state of the union of Zero Running Back. What has changed? How are we approaching things differently? The whole market has shifted. Are we still loving Zero RB as much as we did 10 years ago? We're going to get into all that here with the perfect person to talk to, Ben Gretch of Ship Chasing and Stealing Bananas and stealing lines and stealing signals and stealing everything. He's a thief. We're going to get into all things Zero RB here on Spike Week. Let's do it. I didn't even add Ben to the show. This is how great start. We're off to a phenomenal start. We instead of a Zero RB conversation, we were gonna have a zero host conversation here. But of course, it's been a little while since I've been able to talk to Ben. Super excited, just to, of course, to pick Ben's brain in general, but also to talk about what we said in the intro. Zero running back. I think it's a fascinating discussion around this strategy in particular, because it's almost like a bigger thing about the whole fantasy football space. Like I said, 2013 was Sean's original Zero Running Back article. I mean, Ben and I were talking before we hit record about how long we've been doing this now and how old we're getting. That made me feel very old to see how long ago Sean wrote that article. But the game has changed. Like, man, not just from a zero running back perspective, fantasy football has changed so much. So I'm excited to kind of pick your brain and see how you're feeling about, like, man, 10 years of evolution of this game, but of course 10 years of evolution of zero running back, and like where your brain's at on all that now.
Well, it's funny when we talk, you mentioned that, like, 10 years of evolution, because it feels like the first maybe 8, and it's, we're almost at 12 years now or whatever, I guess, or I don't know, whatever. It's 2024, but the first maybe 7 of those years or 6 of those years from 2013 through like 2019-ish, it felt like there was this constant pushback on Zero RB and the principles of it. And I've always felt like the principles of it and the logic of it is sort of infallible. Like, it makes perfect sense. If you do any of the research and anything and you really understand the concept, there's a reason that people like became Zero RB zealots and things like that, because if you really understand it, like, it's not hard to grasp why this could be a strategy that, even if it's not, people were for a long time concerned that it wasn't elevating like the floor, but it's really easy to understand why it could elevate the ceiling, because we've all seen the late round running backs that can smash, and you're like, okay, well, if all the best receivers come in the early rounds and all the top players that, not necessarily always at QB and tight end, but when they hit, they can hit from the early rounds. We've seen, like, go back to 2022, Travis Kelce leads the tight end position by 100 points, right? And he was an early round tight end. And so if you hit on all these early round picks at other positions, and then you're able to also smash with late round running backs in a way that it's hard to smash to that degree with late round plays at other positions. I mean, the way that running back works and the volume and all of these things, and it's replaceable. And so you can tell yourself the story like, oh, I can have this roster that has no flaws. And so the logic of it always makes sense. But for a long time, you're talking about that 10-year evolution. For a long time, it was just like trying to explain to people that, yeah, it made sense, because a lot of people would say for a long time, it can't win the major tournaments. You have to have the early elite running backs. And so for a long time, it was like, no, I mean, it's just a matter of time. There's just not enough people that have been drafting it yet. And then it got more popular, and then more people started drafting it. And then it's proven that point as well. The last 2 regular season BBM champions have basically been Zero RB rosters. You have people that are winning major tournaments now. And so just in the last maybe like 4 years is really where I feel like the evolution is that, like a lot of products, it's a flat evolution for a long time and then exponential. These last couple years, it's really, really taken off. It's been way more widespread in its acceptance. You have people that would have never dreamed of drafting even one Zero RB team who are now mixing it into their portfolios. And I think it's not going to stop, right? I mean, especially with best ball taking over the way that it is, and the different portfolio discussions and all of those things, people understand you need to have some exposure to this build strategy.
It's funny. I hadn't even thought about it that way but it is so spot on where, like you said, it reminds me of, I'm a weird, like kind of, I enjoy like the business world and startup stories and all those, the typical bullshit. Like I was working out of my garage and building my startup for, and I failed for 10 years. And then finally I got my big break type of a thing. Like that's what happened with Zero RB. It was like, no, I'm telling you, this is a good idea. And you're just, no investor wants to invest. Nobody gives a shit. You're just like, no, you're a dumb young kid with a stupid pipe dream. Right. And then all of a sudden, poof, it was like, it starts winning. More smart, the industry started to blow up to an extent that like there's more content, more people doing draft streams, which didn't really exist in the past. And so it was this perfect combination of a lot of different things. But it was like you said, I mean, it was nearly a decade of nobody giving a shit except the Zero RB zealots who were probably doing fantasy, but also there was like FFPC out there, or like, and like, no offense, I'm not saying anything wrong with FFPC. I like it and I play there too. Like the best ball coming about, and there being $1 million prizes and stuff out there on Underdog and DraftKings and everything, like changed the game. And people were, oh, so there's smart people out there doing this, and now they're winning with it, like you said. And so I do think that like totally changed the game. So shout out to Underdog again and DraftKings and everybody for that. If you had to think like what has changed the most, like since that, maybe exclude those 9 years, right? But for these last like three or four years, like I remember us talking like even on Ship Chasing, and like I pulled up just quickly before we went on the show the 2013 first round ADP just to look at it, which is funny. Everybody should do this every once in a while. 11 running backs in the first round, and Calvin Johnson was the first round selections there. So obviously that has changed a lot here. But is there anything like that just like jumps out to you as like, the market has changed so much, like sort of in relation to zero running back?
Well, one of my favorite things about that point you just made is when people like to go at the original Zero RB article and be like, oh, well, I mean, when Sean originally wrote it, he said you take a running back in the 5th round or something. I think he says something about the 5th round, which people don't understand how extreme that was in 2013. And you just said it. There was 11 running backs going in the first round of an average 12 picks. Last year there was what, like 4? I mean, I don't even know if there was 4. It was all receivers last year. Mm-hmm. And so it was a completely different landscape when he wrote that. And if you have any intellectual honesty whatsoever and you adjust for like era adjusting like we do with stats, you would understand what the, conceptually and all of those things. But that just gets to the point of, I just had to take a little shot at people who have always taken shots at Zero RB. There's such bad faith arguments. If you want to have a real discussion, you'll be able to really be able to, frankly, pick apart a lot of the counterpoints, because no one's saying you have to draft Zero RB in every single draft. It's something that you, especially when the draft sets up that way, you have to be willing to go to. It used to be you had to take running backs, and the whole point was, well, you don't have to actually. Like here's an idea. Let's not take any in the first few rounds. Like instead of, like you said, 11 out of the 12 picks, it was, well, first 10 picks are running backs. I better go running back. I'm going to run out of running backs. It's like a running back avalanche. Now we talk about the wide receiver avalanche. Yeah. When you talk about what's happened in these last few years, it really has been the wider spread adoption of it. I think you see more and more Zero RB builds in drafts you're in. It used to be when I was doing it in drafts in 2016, 2016 was coming off a Zero RB crush in 2015. So it was adopted a little more in 2016, and then it struggled in 2016, and then people went away from it again. But say 2017 or 2018, a couple of those years, I would be the only one in a draft doing it. And nowadays you'll get into drafts and there's sometimes 3-4 other people doing it. And it becomes a little bit more challenging to implement it, certainly. And yet at the same time, again, when you understand the tenets, we talk about the wide receiver avalanche and those things. The idea is pretty sound that the elite wide receivers year over year tend to come from not the first 2 rounds, but before like a wide receiver window, as I often talk about it in my writing, before the end of maybe round 10, you don't get guys in round 15 at wide receiver that end up finishing extremely, extremely high. Now I'm saying this coming off a year where Puka Nacua wasn't even drafted in a lot of drafts, and he finished like top 5. So that, I mean, there's nothing that doesn't have an exception in football. That's like rule number 1. There's always exceptions. But when you look at the broad trends, it's very clear that over a large enough sample, we have an idea of where the talent lies at wide receiver, where the volume's going to be. You can't just lose your routes in an offense the way that a running back can lose touches. Look at Puka Nacua's teammate Kyron Williams. Going into the year, it looked like Cam Akers, right? And then Cam Akers is just not the guy anymore. They're done with him. They end up trading him. Kyron Williams gets all the volume right away. And there was some buzz and some rumors they liked him, but I don't think anyone really expected that by like week 2, this guy's going to be the every down player in this backfield. And so that's the kind of thing that can happen at running back. It doesn't happen at wide receiver. Even when guys struggle, they still are out there running routes because there's 3 receivers on any play. You know, there's all these old ideas that we've talked through, but the bottom line is like the data, the information that we know on each position tells us that, you know, it makes a lot of sense to be taking these early wide receivers. They're going to be higher floor. They're at times going to be higher ceiling. Your best chance to hit the real difference makers are in the earlier stages. And so even when people are taking a lot of receivers early, you have to kind of lean into that. And so, I mean, that's the biggest thing for me is it's kind of the inverse of what you were talking about in 2013, where like people would just lean into running back avalanches. And now and that didn't make sense, right? And that's where the zero RB, you know, idea came from, is like, well, what if we just didn't, you know, lean into this? Now you have the opposite part of the equation becoming more and more interesting to think through, which is, well, we have wide receiver avalanches. At what point do you lean away from that? And one of the big things that I was preaching last year was maybe a wide receiver start. And then I've written about the running back dead zone for years, but we actually had a really interesting dead zone in 2023. And so the strategy that I told, you know, my subscribers over at Stealing Signals, and we talked about a lot on Stealing Bananas, was wide receiver start, and then be willing to hit in the dead zone, hit some of the guys that, I mean, guys like J.K. Dobbins who didn't hit, but some of the Breece Halls and Jahmyr Gibbs and a lot of those guys. And that strategy ended up being really strong. But I think it's unique to an ever-changing market now, where for several years I was writing never take a running back in rounds 4 and 5, essentially, because it was that extreme. It was that clear that you didn't want to be taking running backs in those areas. And there's a couple trends that have changed at running back. The types of running backs that go in that range have been, you know, like a Gibbs has been now a type of young upside profile has been pushed into that range instead of just guaranteed touch counts and those types of things, which were easier to fade. And then also just the fact that wide receivers were so heavy early, it made for different incentives and different dynamics. And so anyways, I think the whole concept of zero RB and the way that it's evolving, it gets back to the same thing from the very beginning, which is you have to understand the core tenets of it. You have to understand why you're doing it, where the positional strengths are, what the goals of it are, and then be able to adjust as the market adjusts. As more people are doing zero RB, how are you going to, lean into it or go the other direction? That's, I think, what the 2024 and beyond question is.
I think the kind of the last thing you said there, and you hit on it a few different times, but the willingness to adjust and the willingness to assess the market. And like that was some of the core principles originally about zero running back. And I think that's what gets lost a lot of the time in the whole running back discourse, right? It becomes you like running backs or you don't, right? You understand. It's like if only wide receivers went, right? Like if the whole first 5 rounds was wide receivers, we would be having different conversations about how do we play this game, because of, and now there's a lot of problems with, say, going against the grain on that, when, you still have to put together a team that can win the tournament, even if you don't love the price, whatever. But it's all like zero RB really is assessing the game that we're playing and assessing what our opponents are doing and saying, there's this gap here where I can build this super team and the market, and like my opponents are never doing it. Back then, especially, no one was even, like you said, you would show up to a draft and be the only person every time that was drafting zero running back. So no one was doing it. And here's this really, like you said, this infallible use case as to why it works and how it can win you tournaments. And that is like the core tenet. All the like round by round stuff and like, the running back conversation is part of it, but it really all boils down to we're trying to beat our opponents at something, and you highlighted a perfect way that I actually believe your like ability to diagnose zero running back and be a good zero running back drafter led you to diagnose the market last year in a way that, just like somebody who just was a zero RB zealot said, I'm never drafting anybody in the top 5 rounds at running back, would not be able to do. And that's what people who can't understand zero running back do in the opposite direction. You were able to say, no, clearly I believe in zero running back, but this market is funny. There's Jahmyr Gibbs here and Breece Hall here and Travis Etienne and J.K. Dobbins and a bunch of guys these are not 5th round running backs. Like, this is not a 5th round running back, and I know the market has changed. So they're probably not going to be first rounders like Doug Martin in 2013, was a 1st round running back. It's not that, but it is like a kind of using a tenet of zero running back, but then like tweaking it based on the market to, extract the most value from what's available in the market. And in 2024, like, it doesn't mean that exists. Like, you may go right back to being like, nope, no running backs. Or you might say, I don't know, these running backs look awesome in the 1st round. There's Gibbs and Bijan and Achane and obviously McCaffrey. And like, you might want those guys and then go to zero, right? I'll take Bijan, but there is no 5th round Jahmyr Gibbs this year. So guess what? Now it becomes what we would call like a hero running back build, right?
Right.
When I do that, which is still taking the zero running back principles, but just slightly tweaking it because the market has changed.
Yeah, and it's funny, the hero running back thing was like, originally Sean was calling it modified zero RB. And I remember like literally 5 years ago now talking with him about that. And there wasn't an anchor running back thing yet. And there wasn't a hero running back thing yet. And he was calling it modified zero RB, honestly, like a year before anyone was really talking about anchor running back and that stuff. Like, not just, caping up for my friend here. Like, that's, I think, legitimately the way that it went down. Mm-hmm. And he called it that because when you did shows with him and talked to him at that time, it was so clear that one of the key points he would say is, like, philosophically, that type of a draft is so much more similar to a zero RB draft than the people that are doing like wide receiver, and then starting to hammer running back in like round 4, 5, 6. That's when the dead zone was so clear. And he was like really trying to preach at that time. And anyone who was talking about zero RB at that time is like, if you start zero RB, you have to continue it. You have to commit to it. Because at that time, the big issue was people would try it for the first time. They'd pull out of it too early. They'd start taking running backs in the dead zone because they're like, I got to get some running backs at some point. What am I going to do? Go 5 rounds without a running back? What the hell is going to happen then? Like, when am I going to be able to take my running backs? And so they start taking them in 5, 6, 7, start loading up on running backs. Then they don't accomplish the other goals. They don't get enough depth at receiver. They don't get the elite onesie position options that can allow you to build these elite rosters. And that's the worst way to try to build the tenets of zero RB. Now, again, you go back to the original zero RB article, and it did at that time talk about, okay, well, you could wait until maybe round 5-ish to take a running back. And so that's where people got lost on this concept, I think, is that you had to adjust for the fantasy landscape changing over 10 years, where, there's not 11 running backs that go in the 1st round anymore, and everything's different. And as that continues to change, as you were sitting there talking about, Gibbs and some of those guys, the Breece Halls and the ETNs in the 4th round, and like, especially like an ETN. I mean, ETN last year, I remember talking about him not feeling that different than Tony Pollard, like profile wise, efficient runners, productive offenses you would expect. You're hoping for some explosive plays, certainly. But like Tony Pollard is going 1-2 turn most of the offseason, and ETN's going in the 4th round for some reason. It's kind of hard to understand why for most drafters. That kind of got ETN in the 4th round. That kind of thing never used to happen. And so one of the things that has happened with wide receivers getting pushed up and the wide receiver avalanche and more adoption of zero RB is it actually makes zero RB easier to implement now on the running back side. You get better values at every stage. And so, like you said, that made me adjust to the market in 2023 and be interested in round 4, round 5 running backs. But I wasn't advocating hammering running backs all the way through there till round 9. It was, okay, well, we'll stop and take a detour a couple of times here, take maybe 1-2 running backs. And so it's sort of now a modified anchor, hero, whatever you want to say, right? Now we're doing all sorts of modifications. I didn't take any in the first 3 rounds, but I'm going to take them in 4 and 5. And then I'm going to continue my goals from 6 through 9 that are not running back focused, because also now, I mean, it's all about where are the pockets of value at each positions. And now round 10 and beyond, round 9 or wherever, round 8, I mean, it depends, what draft you're in and all these things. But David Montgomery in round 8, like those types of opportunities, now you can build a ridiculous running back core as well. You can get the guaranteed volume that you had to use to pay a 4th round pick for in round 8. That really started with the Josh Jacobs year a couple years ago, where it was like, none of us want to take Josh Jacobs. That's a lesson that I had to learn. I very well admit, I don't pretend like I saw that one coming, but it is one of those things where it's like, look, I mean, especially in best ball, when you can't make the waiver claims all year and all those things, sometimes you do want to take that type of discounted guaranteed volume, quote unquote, in round 8, round 9, round 10, because it doesn't have as much of an opportunity cost if you've implemented the first 7 rounds well and hit, a pretty 0 RB-ish type build. I mean, at this point, the way that I would define sort of the 0 RB tenants and those things is you just can't be deep at running back early. I mean, even hyper fragile is like, well, let's do modified hyper fragile. Let's do 3 running backs, and then the 4th one will be in the 12th round. We don't want to take too much running back depth early, right? And it used to be, I mean, even the grinders, you talked about FFPC, where you can play 2 running backs and 2 flexes. The grinders used to take 5 running backs in the first 5 rounds because they could start 4. And then they would never admit the capitulation on 0 RB, but they loved after like a year or 2 ago to act like they hadn't capitulated, but it was all anchor running back at a point. And there was a clear change in a lot of their draft structure where you'd see 1, maybe 1, 2, and then it was the dead zone was no longer running backs for a lot of these long time grinders. I play in a lot of those season-long leagues over there. It seems to me that most everyone has recognized that element of it, that a really big part of the 0 RB thing and the evolution of it is what used to be the robust idea. Running backs are going to get hurt, so I'm going to draft a lot of them early. That doesn't really exist anymore, and that's the thing you can't do anymore. You can take your spots where the pockets of value are. Last offseason, it maybe was round 4, round 5, more than most years. But that doesn't mean you just hammer running back. You can't be that exposed. You build too fragile of a roster, and eventually those rosters just fail because you can't keep all those running backs healthy. It's a really thin needle to thread. You also sacrifice the receiver upside because then you're just trying to backfill with like Van Jefferson types. Good luck. So you really want to be, especially as running backs get cheaper, you want to be hitting running backs in those later rounds. You don't want to be taking volume early. You want to be taking volume at that position late, I think. Not in every single draft, but in most drafts, in most builds. That's sort of like a short, Cliff's Notes way of trying to think through it. At the same time, like, again, you have to be flexible. So, yeah, I mean, it's not every draft, right? I mean, like, you always want to be willing to adjust to where the value is in a given year, and in especially in relation to those actual tenants. I mean, for a long time, the value was so clearly in these 0 RB type builds, and the structural advantages were so clearly in that direction, whether that was anchor running back, whether it was a strict 0 RB, but not hitting the dead zone with running backs was the big thing for several years, making sure you're getting receiver depth in those single digit rounds. And that's that part of it has shifted. And so now it's, how do you want to play around that? But I don't think the answer is ever going to be, well, let's just take running backs every round, because
I agree. I think about it like, so I'm a big basketball fan. I think actually I'm barely 6 foot tall and white, so I never stood a chance, playing basketball. So I focused on football mostly for my athletics, but I've always loved basketball. Like, grew up playing basketball. I still honestly, my guilty pleasure really is basketball, because football has become a little bit more like a job. Honestly, Sundays are a work day, you know what I mean? And so that took a little bit of the joy, I guess, out of football. But so I love basketball. I love the strategy around basketball. And it reminds me of like the 3-point evolution in basketball, where for a long time, and still to this day, a huge subset or now a small subset of, whether it be actual basketball players, coaches, or just people, out there like us, would deny the 3-point thing. with despite the infallible math that no one can you can't deny it. The three's worth more than two, right? Three's more efficient. We can get into all the corner three is the most efficient shot in basketball, all that kind of stuff. But people would deny it. But even once it started to become adopted, right? 3-point shot became very popular. NBA teams start taking it more and more and more. The teams who would not fully commit, right? Or the players even who would not fully commit, just eventually become a worse version of everybody else that's out there. And you can be very talented, right? You can be a very good drafter. You can be better. You can be better than most other people at evaluating talent and finding these right players. But when you don't commit to this core principle that is not debatable, and like you said, there's just no path to winning in a way where you really steer the opposite direction. And you definitely have no path to where you kind of steer into it and then back out. Like you said, what people would do. They would get to round 5 and you're like, oh my God, no, I don't have a running back. I can't do this. I have to fill out my starting lineup. That was kind of the running bit was I have to fill out my starting lineup. It reminds me of the 3-point thing where it was the Warriors just kept beating everybody because of course they have the best 3-point shooters. That's part of it. We got to find the best players, right? If you drafted J.K. Dobbins, tough shit. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You wanted Brees and Jahmyr Gibbs there, but once we assume that we're going to be able to get some of these guys right on our teams, you have to steer into it. And that, you cannot. The no half measures, you know what I mean? You're never going to reach the full goal backing out before you get there. And that's it all. It just constantly reminds me of the 3-point thing. Cause right now it's Jesus Christ, you watch an NBA game. Every team puts up 40 3-pointers in a game. It's pretty much been now we're to the point where teams are we're going to go big. These teams they're going bigger and trying to manipulate the fact that everybody's so focused on the 3, but it took a long time to get there. And so many teams died off along the way by not fully committing to it, exactly like what you said.
And one of the things that, as you're saying that it makes me think of is as we talk about this and we say it's more adoption of it and all those things, it can feel like the edge is lost a little bit. We're talking about being in drafts where there's more drafters that are doing similar. And I don't think that's the case. As you're talking about it, there's obviously everyone's on a different timeline, basically. And there's people that will just put their head in the sand and deny the obvious from day one. And then there's other people that are right there with you, and they're quick to adjust to the actual data, the information, and they're analytically savvy and all of those things. But it's easy, when you're in sort of some of the echo chambers and things like that, to think that everybody is as accepting of this truth as you are. We're sitting here saying this is so obvious. We did this on ship chasing, as you mentioned, a couple years ago, and we sat around, us two and Pat and Pete, and basically had this type of conversation a couple years ago, and we're there's no way to deny it. I mean, if you go back and watch that, that's basically the way that I would put a headline. I haven't gone back and watched it, but as I remember it, the headline was basically us just being you'd have to be an idiot to deny this stuff. It's very obvious. And then immediately you shared some stuff with me recently. Immediately the usage of zero running back spiked after that. And a lot of people were pointing at that one show where it was kind of a popular show. But the funny thing is the audience
this guy right
for that show. Yeah, there you go.
One of these, it's somewhere around here. 2 years ago, like you said. It was these behemoths, these 2.5 hour marathons.
Very long streams.
I don't really remember the ends of them, so maybe I should go rewatch. There was some other things prohibiting me by the end of those. But like you said, it's so funny to look back. They're 2 years ago ship chasing episodes. The impact that you guys and those shows had on this whole space was hilarious. And I'll pull up the chart that you're referencing.
But even that. Yeah, the jump and that's viewers of ship chasing. That's self-selecting people that are in that that then immediately sort of started implementing that. There are so many other drafters that continue to deny it for the last couple of years since, and they are maybe still denying it. Or this year they're maybe going to dip their toes into zero RB a little bit, but they're behind. They're still an edge. It's kind of I don't know, Bitcoin. People just continue to be behind and the same lesson gets learned over and over again, right? There's a lot of examples probably better ones than that. But you can feel like the moment has passed, and then you're like, oh, there's still meat on this bone. Like there's still a lot of casuals out there that are not they're not watching shows that have sicko on the screen, right? Like, I mean, exactly. there's a certain element that gets missed there. So, and then you also sent me that article that was, I don't know the author's name off the top of my head.
Billy Jones. Billy Jones. He's awesome. We brought him in. Judge, I just want to give him a shout out before we dive into the article that he did. He's going to do a massive series we're calling The Formula on Spike Week. He is a data scientist. This guy can talk circles around me about all of this kind of stuff. He's brilliant, but he's doing these kind of data and evidence-based research studies around best ball. And he did one on zero running back. It's up on the site. I'll put it in the description of this video as well. That's Ben and I were talking a little bit about it before we hit record. We'll talk about it now, but like super interesting, just the data and how it's about how people are drafting, of course, relative to zero running back, but like how people are putting players together, right? How they're using the market, how they're putting these puzzle pieces together alongside zero running back. And then also, if you didn't draft the zero running back team, how did they put those same puzzle pieces together? Did they put those right? Like Jaylen Warren is a certain puzzle piece on zero running back teams, and he's a different puzzle piece on non-zero. All of that stuff is super duper interesting. Yeah, for sure. And you just kind of alluded to it, but towards the end, like with the Jaylen Warren point as well, he talks about a lot of the players that had specific, what their ownership was on specific zero RB teams. Jaylen Warren, probably no surprise, was the highest on zero RB builds. He was on 20.7% of those teams, like 2.5 times the random 1 in 12 rate of 8.3%. And that makes sense because if you're doing zero RB, you're not taking your running backs early. You're more likely to be taking your running backs late. And so the popular later round running backs, but it also makes sense from the perspective of most everyone who was interested in zero RB. A lot of the analysts that I know were really in on Jaylen Warren. I was really in on Jaylen Warren. I know Pat Crane was really in on Jaylen Warren. You guys were. I mean, there's a lot of people that really liked Jaylen Warren from this same sphere of they were the same people that were saying draft zero RB. And I think you see that with a lot of the names on this list and some of the combinatorial stuff that he gets into, which is really interesting. You should definitely go read it. But I think part of it is like, okay, yeah, you can call it like groupthink or an echo chamber. I think it's also just an evidence that zero RB is still like, in some respects, not in its infancy, but it's still coming along slowly. If you can point to a lot of these players that, some of it is just their late round running backs, but I was saying to you before, like some of the specific names, a lot of these are just all the running backs that are going on like round 10 and round 11, because you're really likely to be taking running backs in that range. So Damian Harris, AJ Dillon, Rashad Penny, Elijah Mitchell, Warren, a lot of those, Antonio Gibson, a lot of these guys have very similar ADPs, and you were Devon Achane right there. A lot of those guys, that's like basically the list of players that were going in that round 10, 11, 12 range last year. So a lot of it is just like, okay, yeah, I was taking those guys at that time. But some of the ones that are higher up, it does just to me speak to the fact that there's some bias toward the specific people, like maybe analysts or groups of people that are more likely to be drafting zero RB that liked to draft certain ways and take certain players. And we're advocating to draft to be in on this player or what have you. And that to me says, okay, well, zero RB is still a little bit of a cult, right? Like it's still a little bit of like, there's only certain people that are doing it, which means, Billy's article here has some really interesting thoughts about like, you could potentially get, differentiated by not following the exact same player trends, which makes some sense, but there's also some counterpoints to that as well. But at the same time, like one of the counterpoints to me would be like, I think a lot of these picks were smart picks, right? It's like I was in on a lot of these picks. And so I'm not going to necessarily pick worse. The differentiating point makes sense, but I think it's really interesting in best ball to talk about differentiation. We talked about this a little bit before the show, but I'll just run through a couple quick thoughts. Like there's 18 roster spots.
me making one decision different to take some, older running back, less sexy running back isn't necessarily going to differentiate my roster. The contest structure also differentiates the roster to some degree. You could draft the same roster, identical roster twice, and one might advance to the final and one might not, just because of the pods they get put into. So there are some elements there where it's like you're going to get weeded out regardless. You could have the same roster as some other 0RB drafters, very similar combinatorial stuff, and it's not the very best roster. And so you're the one who's luckily gets into the lucky pods and gets through, and all the other ones get weeded out. And then you have a very live roster in the final that, isn't matching anyone else. My point is there's a lot of different ways to think through like the differentiation and that kind of stuff. But I think this is a really interesting starting point. But like I said, I also think part of it comes from, brings to mind this point of 0RB is still a little bit of a hive and a smaller group of people that are doing it. There's good points made here again by Billy about potentially differentiating. There's also, some interesting notes here about like, as much as it's getting adopted more, it's still not like being heavily adopted, like different ways of playing off of it. Even just like the concepts we were talking about a little bit ago about taking a couple guys in the dead zone, right? Like a lot of obviously they wouldn't necessarily be classified as 0RB builds then if you took a round 5 receiver, and this is looking at stuff through 7 rounds potentially on some of these. But there's different ways to differentiate by just modifying your structure a little bit and sticking to the tenets. I don't think it's that hard to get off the same players necessarily, but anyway, the point I'm trying to make is just that I do think this data is interesting from the perspective of potentially being evidence that 0RB is not as mainstream yet.
I love that takeaway. I actually think, and I didn't even pick that up at first this is why we talk to other smart people. I didn't even pick that up necessarily. And then like the moment you said it and you're like, well, I think it's kind of just like, all of us 0RB bros also really like Jaylen Warren. And so when we're the people drafting 0RB, he fits the structure and we really like him. So it's like, yeah, he's going to be on here. And the other caveat to that, to the just, natural, should we differentiate or not, is like, there is a level, just like in DFS, ownership is just a raw number. It doesn't actually tell us anything. What the player should be owned at, right, in a DFS contest. Just because a player is chalk, let's just use Jaylen Warren. Najee's out for a one game. Jaylen Warren is clearly going to be very popular. That doesn't, just because he is going to be, this is like, 2017 DFS where like, but the casual players will still do this. The casual wannabe tournament bros, right, will say, oh my God, he's going to be so popular. I can't play him. He's going to be so popular. And it's like, no, but like, what should he be owned? Right. If 5K Jaylen Warren is playing without Najee Harris, it's like he should be like 98% owned. Like, the ownership is like, so he comes in at 65 and you faded him and he was like, that's the dumbest. You should have just flushed that money down the toilet. Right. So now, I'm not saying that Jaylen Warren on 0 running back teams is that example, but I mean, shit,
in some ways he was, because Najee was the great example of the early type of running back we wanted to fade. He had been really poor in efficiency for the first couple of years. He was all touches. And there was a lot of belief that Mike Tomlin had to play a workhorse back. That was his whole background and all that stuff. And a lot of the people that were in on Warren, like myself, were like, that's just because he's always sort of had workhorses or he's had reasons to play workhorses. He's not going.
Le'Veon Bell. Of course, he has a workhorse.
He's not going. And then James Conner was very productive and immediately won the job. But he's not going to just keep putting a inferior talent out there when this backup is showing a lot of skill-based arguments to get more playing time. And that baton, that torch was passed in 2022. That was clear. He was trying to force Najee in 2022, and Warren was just better than him. And so last offseason, the people that were advocating for Warren, like myself, were like, this is a perfect example of why 0RB works. A lot of people want to believe that there's guaranteed volume here for Najee Harris, and there isn't guaranteed volume, at least the way that we were analyzing it, and that ended up being true. They basically played 50-50 all year. I mean, it actually wasn't a workhorse situation at all from week one. It wasn't because of an injury or anything like that. It was like, look, we can't keep Jaylen Warren off the field. How can we look this guy in the face who's making plays every time we put him on the field and tell him you're not going to be on the field anymore so we can put Najee 3.5 yards per carry, give him every touch just because we took him in the first round 3 years ago. I mean, eventually that draft capital wears off, right? And so really Warren was the poster boy for a lot of the conceptual stuff that you're already thinking about when you're thinking about zero RB. It makes sense that people that were willing to fade guaranteed touches and fade that type of inefficiency in the early rounds of drafts at running back for more interesting number 2 backs that have better skill-based and stat-based, like advanced stat-based arguments for work. Maybe they can earn more work, which is a big part of the zero RB thing. I mean, Jaylen Warren was the poster boy for that whole conceptual like idea, right? And so I think it does make sense that he was the guy that everyone was in on, that loved, that was willing to try the strategy as well.
And so to that point, right, you see on your screen, he was on, we'll just call it 21% of zero running back rosters, right? Jaylen Warren was drafted onto 21% of them. Naturally, if there's no player selection bias and everybody's drafted on 8%, just over 8% of teams, right? Because you're 1 out of 12. You can only be drafted on one team in every draft. So he's 2.5, right? 2.5 times his ownership on zero running back versus just normal rosters across all best ball. I think I would argue that's too low, actually, for, like you said, for it's that example. He's the best play of the slate in that DFS example. He's the best draft pick on zero running back teams. And we're clearly going to be naturally overweight this area of the draft of running backs. So he should be 2.5, 3, 4 times the field on zero running back teams. And so that's why, like you said, the takeaway of like just looking at these numbers, I don't think is the takeaway. Some of these for sure are probably too high. I'm not going to sit here and argue, like, we don't need to go down the whole fucking list. But I think that it's important to note that just like, oh man, we were all taking Jaylen Warren. Well, let's think about why. The next name that's on here, I think, is a very interesting one. Devonta Smith. I would say the non-running backs are actually the most interesting ones. The running backs are going to be higher, right? Hey, you need to draft running backs, and you actually need to draft a lot of them when you draft zero RB best ball teams, right? You're taking 7 or whatever running backs on a team. So these double-digit round running backs, like they have to be more than 8% because like you just that's how the math works, right? But the wide receivers are this trickle-down effect that happens on zero on running back teams because you're not drafting any of the running backs in the first however many rounds, in this example 7. So the top 7 rounds are not running backs. That's going to naturally boost up your exposure, the ownership in this table on, like, say, wide receivers. And Devonta Smith ended up at the same ownership as Jaylen Warren on zero running back teams. I like Devonta Smith. I think most zero running back people like Devonta Smith. Probably non-zero running back people were fine with Devonta Smith, but he's a trickle-down effect that, again, you and I were talking about this before we hit record, that like, I don't know that I have an answer to it, because the alternative is, okay, I want to back off some Devonta Smith on my zero running back teams because he's not really the reason why I'm drafting zero running back. Like his position and his profile is great, but like, I don't want my whole season to be centered around second round Devonta Smith. But then, like, if I pull up somebody else, if I do something else, all I'm doing is moving from Devonta Smith to T. Higgins, as you see here, who's also at 19% of zero running back teams. Or I think Jalen Hurts is on here. Mark Andrews. Like, those are the other guys who got really high exposure on zero running back teams.
Early, it's like second, third round, the 2-3 turn where there was a lot of running backs going there. You had Ramondre Stevenson, all those guys going there. And if you didn't want to take a running back, you had to take those receivers or Mark Andrews or Jalen Hurts. I mean, that's sort of, and I mean, I imagine just below this list, you'd run into, the other quarterbacks that are going there, like Mahomes and Josh Allen were both sometimes going there. And you run into Chris Olave, maybe didn't quite make it far enough back into the second round and enough of these. Part of the Devonta Smith and T. Higgins thing is sometimes those guys would fall into the third, and then if you're drafting 0B, you're snapping them up every time. And so then Olave never really fell into the third, so you're not getting as much of him getting boosted overall. But like, what's the alternative? And like we were talking before the show, it's like, well, you take a receiver from the 3-4 turn that you really like, that you're already probably drafting a ton in zero RB, like a Keenan Allen or a Deebo Samuel, and you start drafting him at the 2-3 turn just to get a different exposure to receivers. And so, I mean, part of it is just driven by the ADP. That would allow you to differentiate. You would get some different combinations of, Keenan Allen with Justin Jefferson or whoever, one of the top receivers, and you're getting different pairings at that point. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. But your great point back to me when I brought up Keenan Allen before the show was now I'm just shifting all of my overweight ownership on Devonta to Keenan Allen because we're already drafting him at 3-4 if we like him. So now we're drafting him at 2-3. Now we just have a ton of Keenan Allen. And I mean,
now I got 20.
That would look better.
Yeah.
We know that Keenan Allen had a great year, so that would look better in hindsight. Like the Devonta Smith stuff looks bad, but it also would look better if Devonta Smith would have just had a good year. That would have been nice.
100%. The other thing I wanted to call out that I really like in here is this first chart. I spent probably way too much time just like staring at this, and it's really not that complex. My brain's just small. So first, to go back to the ship chasing show, the spikes that you can see here that occurred a couple of years ago. So you see, if you're watching this, so here is the percentage of teams who had no running backs, right? This is just through 3 rounds, okay? In Best Ball Mania 2, so just a couple of years ago, it was actually continuing to trend down. People were taking more running backs from the start of Best Ball Mania 2 till the time we had that show. This date right here is a ship chasing episode.
People think you're like you're exaggerating, but this is exactly what happened.
It's 100% what happened. Billy, hop in the comments. Billy will prove it to you. We went over it. There's a date on here, and it's like 2 days after the ship chasing episode, and all of a sudden it was like poof. Everybody was like, "Oh my gosh," Now we're going to draft some zero running back. Then it kind of levels off, right? But you see the same thing down here, where this one I believe is through 5 rounds. Where same thing, very similar time frame. It spikes. People are taking more zero running back teams through 5 rounds. But the most interesting part to me, in terms of thinking about zero running back moving forward, is down here, which is 0 running backs through 7 rounds. And this has like not really like to your point about people not being willing to like really stick with it. I think this has been the thing I've screwed up a lot. You saw that list of all those zero running back guys that people were taking and they all sucked. Yeah, I drafted all of them. Damian Harris, like I drafted Devonta Smith.
Yeah,
I drafted all those dudes. So like my player selection has not been phenomenal in the last couple of years, certainly not last year. But these dark blue, navy blue section down here, I think is where I found my edge. Straight structural, had to do nothing else except not take a running back through 7 rounds more than the field is doing it, of which they're doing it at 2% of the field. Still, we think that right. We've seen the market shift. We saw that huge spike. We saw wide receiver ADPs skyrocket and running back ADPs fall. And yet, people are not drafting zero running back to that level, right? They'll wait maybe through 5, but they're not going to wait till round 9 to take their first running back.
This stood out to me too immediately, and I completely agree with everything you just said. I have not looked at like my teams like in depth really enough yet, but I am really curious to look at it. I'm certain I drafted more than 2% from. It's like not drafting running back through 7 for someone like me who's done zero RB over enough years to understand that, there are years where it doesn't work, but then there are years where it can absolutely smash. Like, it's not hard for me to commit to it. What I used to write about it like 5 years ago was like, it's uncomfortable. This is the way I tried to get people to really buy in. It's uncomfortable, but you have to understand that going in, you're going to want to take a running back in round 6 and like people are. After round 5, they're grabbing a running back in round 6. It's uncomfortable to go that long, but man, I mean, it's surprising to me that only 2% of people are going 7 rounds. I don't think it's that hard, especially in this landscape. In this landscape where we're talking about David Montgomery in round 8. It's one of my best teams. The first running back I drafted was Dalvin Cook in like round 9, and then it was A.J. Dillon. And those guys both sucked, but it had Raheem Mostert and Jaylen Warren and a couple other dudes on the back end. It was a full 0 RB. It was, I think, my best regular season team in the BBM. I'm just thinking back to like some of the specific rosters. I know I drafted some pretty apparently still extreme 0 RB teams. To me, just like seems like that's what a 0 RB team is. You know what I mean? That shouldn't be that extreme. I agree with you completely. The fact that that's still only happening in 2% of drafts is a huge mistake. 1 in 50 entries. I mean, that's and really the way that it played out this year proves that. But also, I mean, I think the way that it played out, when I say that, I mean, look, Jaylen Warren was good. Raheem Mostert scored all those touchdowns late. There's other, we had structural reasons to believe that succeeded, but also the point we keep driving home about, as receivers continue to go higher, running backs get cheaper. And so it's almost a thing like the longer you can wait, I know it feels like you're taking receivers way too high when there's a receiver avalanche, I keep saying, which just means there's a lot of you're in a room where everybody's taking receivers and you're like, man, I got to take, whoever in round 3 that should be a round 5 pick. And it doesn't feel comfortable to take that guy over a round 2 running back at that point. Yep. But what you have to tell yourself is, if I take that round 2 running back, I'm only getting 1 round of a discount there. And the way that this draft is going, in round 8, I'm going to be able to get a round 5 running back. I mean, you're going to wind up with even better values all throughout that draft. There's trickle-down effects. As receivers get pushed up, the onesie positions are still going to get drafted in a reasonable range. A lot of times you just find that everyone is pushing the running back position. And you can just build an even more dominant running back core behind even more receiver depth, right? Like through seven rounds, what that allows you is, potentially 5 receivers in an elite quarterback and an elite tight end in 7 rounds. And then you can still get, David Montgomery in round 8 or something like that. I mean, that's a very comfortable RB1 when you have 5 5 legit receivers and an elite at both of the other positions. Like that type of structure is not, to me, I used to write about it as uncomfortable. It is now comfortable. Like that to me is like what I'm comfortable drafting that way. I know that is sound, and it is hard for me to get outside of that structure. Yeah. Actually,
it's funny you say that, because that's legitimately how I feel. I have many flaws and many L's in my past, and there's going to be many more to come. But I think the thing that is kind of like keeping me afloat is not the right word, but keeps your floor high as like a fantasy player is what you just outlined. Just being like feeling totally comfortable with this naturally uncomfortable thing. I'm pulling up this. So this team right here, I strategically took the screenshot when it was in 10th, but it got 12th. It got 12th in Best Ball Mania this year. So that was my best team from this summer. The first running back selected was round 9, Antonio Gibson. So to your point about I waited, right? Certainly far past round 7, and I whiffed. So even though I waited that long, that first guy still sucked. So the equivalent to my first running back was HN, Damian Harris, Algier, whatever, somebody in some, round 12, 13, 14 area. And outside of Kyron, nobody like really hit, right? Kyron was what totally carried this team. HN was obviously great, but Damian Harris on this team, right? So Gibson, useless. Damian Harris, useless. Tajay like kind of popped up for like, what we have in like the best ball world of like a usable week or 2 here or there, right? He was catching some balls, scored a touchdown, but like Tajay was never like a difference maker. I was not winning a tournament. Because of him. Chuba was a little bit like that. I think he had 1 big game. But anyway, like I take Lamar Jackson, right? And the funny thing about this is, like you said, you're drafting a really loaded and deep wide receiver room. I didn't even like hit that big on wide receivers. And I think that's a thing that you'll notice as well about a zero running back build when you do it like what we're outlining here, where you obviously need some luck with health, but like those wide receivers stay healthy and they're just such good football players that even though none of them are Puka and none of them are like, I have Amon-Ra as my wide receiver 1 on this team. None of them are Justin Jefferson and none of them are a couple years ago Cooper Kupp. They're just like so good at the game that like you just get enough, right? Amon-Ra, Waddle, Metcalf, JSN, Gabe Davis, right? It's going to get you like 2 good weeks a season. George Pickens popped up. Like George Pickens was borderline useless, pops up in week 16 or whatever it was for the best game of his career that helps me, right? And it's like, you just have enough juice. You have enough firepower that it carries you all the way through, but you don't get that if you don't push it to the levels like that we're talking about. Like if I ever backed out on this team, like Gabe's not on here. I needed Gabe. I think it was week 15 of this season. Needed him. If I backed out, I don't have George Pickens. And like, I know it doesn't seem like George Pickens had a big year. If I don't have George Pickens, not only do I not make the final, like this team probably loses, like doesn't even make money. And he wasn't even a very good pick, like in our brains, right? And it's like it sounds like nothing, but it's those small little things that you stack them up is like, yeah, but then this team doesn't have George Pickens, right? And who knows, maybe then it doesn't, right? If I backed out and I took whoever, right, a 6th round running back, maybe it doesn't have Kyron.
The picks that you
would finish last.
The picks that you would like to have back are the first running backs you took.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what I was saying with my best team. I remember from the regular season that I was tracking for a while. I mean, it was in like the top 10 overall, and it had Dalvin Cook and AJ Dillon, and those were the top 2, and they hadn't even gotten in my starting lineup through like halfway through the season when this team was like really crushing it. Instead, I just found it had Jaylen Warren, Raheem Mostert, had Gus Edwards, the J.K. Dobbins injury, sort of helped it out. But I mean, it was thriving on receivers. It was a team where I took both Keenan and Mike Evans, who both got off to really fast starts. That is Tyreek Hill. He got off to a really fast start. So anyway, like I looked at that team the whole year and I was like, I wish I didn't take Dalvin Cook and AJ Dillon. Like the first running backs I took, because I actually you don't know which running backs are going to be the hits. When you and Pete, I wrote about this in one of my big running back pieces a couple years ago. I looked at yours and Pete's best ball team from a couple years ago that finished like 10th or whatever, 8th or whatever in the BBM.
It was that
year.
Summer. It was the ship chasing zero.
That was
RB
a ship chasing
summer.
And that was a 0 RB team. And I talked about how this concept of like Frankenstein running back, and I was talking about it more for redraft, but just how it can come together in best ball, how you have certain guys hitting at different points throughout the season. And you guys had a perfect example of that. And so obviously you need depth at running back, similar to what you were just describing with the receivers, where you get the spike weeks at the right time with the receivers. But the point is the running back spike weeks can come from late. You can get, 3 years. I remember when I was writing about that, I was talking about Dearness Johnson had like 3 25+ point games that year. I mean, the names that pop up every year that have 20+ point games for a couple of weeks, and they're cheap. I mean, Alexander Madison did it a few times, and that's why everybody wanted to draft Alexander Madison this past year, because there's a couple times that he had these really exciting starts. And then you realize, okay, well, at this point when he's way more expensive, I'm not going to draft Alexander Madison anymore. But those guys pop up, and you just showed a roster, and I showed a roster where, Kyron Williams was your best running back. He was the last one you took. And some of the other interesting ones, Chuba was the second last one you took, was one of the other arguably most interesting ones on that list. For me, it was probably my 5th one, and Raheem Mostert. The regular season champion was a 0 RB team, but he took a running back in like round 7-ish. And that running back was one of his worst. I remember looking at his team. I can't remember his exact roster. I wish I had it and we could pull it up. It'd be hard to find, I think, in short time. But it had Mostert. I think it had Kyron. If you looked at it, it was like all of his running back points came from his later running backs, or most of his running back points came from the later guys. It's the idea of 0 RB isn't even like, the whole idea of it is that we don't really rank running backs well. That's sort of the point, right? Like we do rank the other positions better. The very elite running backs, the top 15 or so, we tend to predict well, but a lot of them can get hurt. They can have down years. Weird things can happen. Good running backs can have down years because of situation. You have like Saquon Barkley, I think, is a better player than what's happened in his career with the Giants, stuff like that. But ultimately, like it really just comes down to like, we don't rank the position very well. We don't know where the points are going to come from necessarily. I'm not saying you can put it off and just draft running backs in the last like 6 rounds, but I'm not saying you couldn't do that. Like that would have worked this year if you took Mostert and Kyron and Chuba in those rounds. Like legitimately, obviously you wouldn't have necessarily gotten if you built a whole profile of 0 RB teams that only drafted 6 running backs in the last 6 rounds, you probably would have had some teams that made the final. Honestly, because you probably would have mixed in a couple that had Mostert, Chuba, and Kyron. Some of those builds. It's how much are you willing to push it is really what it comes down to. And again, people don't want to get that extreme. That graph you showed, 2.5 or 2% of people waiting until after round 7 to take a running back. That gets back to the point of why for 10 years people didn't want to believe 0 RB because it hasn't won anything yet. but there's no one that's actually doing it. When there's only X amount of teams that are even being built that way, like I just said, if you had a whole 150 teams of just last 6 round running backs, I would have loved to see how that would have went last year, right? And I don't know for certain that would have went really well, but you would have had like a Jerome Ford mixed in there. You would have had Gus Edwards. I mean, you would have had exposure to some running backs in those last 6 rounds. You would have had some Zeke who had some value this year. I mean, you would have had some guys in those later rounds that were actually really productive, and the rest of your roster would have just been top 12 picks at every other position. You'd have had 2 elite tight ends. You'd have had 2 elite QBs. You would have had 8 receivers in the first 10, 12 rounds. I mean, you would have had nothing but high-end upside everywhere else. I honestly think if people were pushing it that extreme, we might have seen a champion either in the regular season or at the end, or at least somebody finishing in the top 10 in the overall or what have you. That was one of these like really extreme 0 RB teams. The fact that we didn't is only evidence of the fact that nobody did it, right? Like there was probably a couple teams like that, but not many. We just saw that only 2% waited until after round 7. So when you have a sample size that's very small of people even trying this, there's not going to be a lot of teams that pop up, but we're showing the ones that we did in our portfolios where we've had this firsthand evidence. I've been doing this 0 RB type drafts for 10-ish years, and I have seen a lot of them. It's why, people become zealots. It's why they start to buy in, because when they do hit, they're like, man, it comes together easy, right? Like you had a team that finished 12th. You had the one with Pete a couple years ago. Those are both 0 RB teams. I mean, those are the ones where you just talked about. You think one of your major edges is a willingness to structurally build in this type of way, and probably just running a little bit hot as well, right? But the ones that are running hot are the ones that are 0 RB teams. And there's obviously, I think, still an edge there. I mean, every time we do one of these shows and talk about 0 RB, I always leave it like, why don't I do even more 0 RB?
Same. I know. And then you get into the draft and you're like, oh, but I like Bijan. You're like every single time I'm like, oh, I'm on the clock and Bijan's available. I like Bijan, and I robotically click them. And I'm not saying don't click Bijan. I mean, we don't need to get into all that. But it is so true. I think that everything that you just said, the fact that running backs, I think, are just woefully mispriced, like you said later. It's gotten better, but we still have this guaranteed touch stuff, and we still have now. There is a much better tipping point on like when do you take James Conner now, and like how much of James Conner do you take? Right, James Conner's not a 3rd round pick anymore. Like 3 years ago, this even like current James Conner would be like really expensive because he projected for so much. He was Najee or whatever. Like there's this constant, push pull. But at the end of the day, I think what you said is like one of the big pillars is everything we already have outlined about 0 running back, and we're so bad at ranking these running backs later, and the market can't wrap their brains around. You don't have a role week 1, or I can't project you for a role week 1, so I can't draft you, in the top 100 or whatever. And it's like, that's not this game, man. Like, go play your DFS teams for week 1 or whatever. Like,
right.
This game is not that. Like, Kyron was a very fluky example, so I don't really want it. But like Tony Pollard for how many years? Like old school Tony Pollard was a double-digit round pick, even though the moment that Zeke would go down, Tony Pollard was like a top 3 running back, like for sure top 5. And it's like people can't wrap their heads around the contingent value and just the chaos of the running back.
And meanwhile, you could, when you structure a 0 RB build correctly, you can also have the Jaylen Warrens. You can have your cake and eat it too, where he's still going to get you a modicum of points and get you a little bit of a floor and usable weeks, like you're talking about with Tajay Spears or maybe Chuba Hubbard, but obviously Chuba had some ceiling games as well. But the idea I just talked about of drafting all running backs in the last 6 rounds, so you would have to start in round 13? You could get around 13 Jaylen Warren at times. He could have been your RB1 in this extreme 0 RB build, and then you hit on Mostert and Kyron or something. I mean, that's probably the team that ends up winning the thing. But you have Warren for week 1 in the early part of the year, or a Mostert or whoever. But like you said, Kyron was kind of an outlier, but there's more than just that. There's guys, Mostert's another one. Obviously, I just said the same names a couple different times, but there's guys that had week 1 roles that went that late. Just because they didn't project for the clean week 1 role, it becomes hard. And then there's the injuries that happen, and then there's everything else that can occur. And those things are hard to predict. I get it, but you can still pick safe players. The Tajay Spears thing was another one where, I mean, nobody who was really paying attention thought Derrick Henry was going to have another 300 touch season at this point in his career. Like Tajay Spears, they drafted him and he was going to play some. Yep. Like he was going to have a role, I think, to some degree. The main reason I'm not coming up with better examples is it's been so long since I've like looked at the like last year's ADP that I can't think of all the names that were being drafted back there. But there's more guys that are available in those ranges that will have roles even early in the year than feels. And so anyway, that's just a little counter to the point of like, well, I'm not going to have any touches in week one. It's like, yeah, I mean, you actually can have that too. You can have your cake and eat it too, right? Like while you wait for the upside scenarios to occur, that might take a little bit of time. And you know, some of the guys, I took a ton of Ty Chandler. It took a long time for Ty Chandler to finally be relevant, but it did happen in the end, right?
Zamir, right. Another name to toss in there. Yep.
Those guys, things could have happened earlier for those guys. I think for Chandler especially, I don't know why things didn't happen earlier for him. It's so funny to hear Kevin O'Connell at this point be like, yeah, we love what we saw from Ty Chandler at the combine. No, he was talking it up. Like, I mean, dude, how did you not know that in August? How was that so difficult?
Does he attend practice? Like, what were you watching in practice that had you trotting Alexander Mattison? Just a couple of other examples and one more point that I wanted to put out there. I think that the timing thing is a huge struggle for other people, but another thing that like conquering that fear, if you will, of the fact that like this guy is probably going to be nothing. And even if he's something, I absolutely have no idea how to predict when it's going to be. Your Alexander Mattison point, actually, the Alexander Mattison and Ty Chandler. So the Vikings running backs have been this weird, both examples of this, that a couple of years ago, Alexander Mattison was on a ton of advancing best ball teams and all that, but he was a stone zero in the playoffs. Like you totally dead roster spot in the playoffs, but Dalvin missed like 3 games or something during the regular season. And you got that top 5 running back production. He also happened to be out against like the Lions and shit. So it was like, then this is old Lions, you know, that couldn't stop the run to save their lives. So you got 30-point games from Alexander Mattison a couple times at a cheap price because he was a backup, right? And this was certainly where the market was not willing to draft those backups very highly. So he was really valuable. Then this year, right, Ty Chandler is talk about a stone zero, all literally a stone, like not even touching the field, a stone zero all season. And then poof, in the fantasy playoffs, you got a really valuable weapon, like a super duper valuable weapon. Another couple guys 2 years ago, Rashad Penny was that. Rashad Penny is like the example like of all examples of that. Hurt and nothing for the entire season, but then he gets healthy and Chris Carson goes down for the fantasy playoffs. And Rashad Penny is the highest scoring running back in fantasy for the fantasy playoffs. Like not McCaffrey, not nobody else. He was the RB1 during that time. That's like the dream because he can only be so popular because he scored 0 points all season and then pops up for the playoffs. Pete and I also drafted Sony Michel, who at the time we drafted him was on the New England Patriots and did not even make it out of camp with that team when we drafted him, and does nothing all year, ends up on the Rams because they had injuries again that year, and is the workhorse for the Rams down the stretch, which is like, again, totally unpredictable, but that's a feature, not a bug. And once you get your like brain to wrap around the fact that it's so unpredictable, and honestly, most of the guys are going to be zeros, but the chaos and the randomness in which that they become something is so valuable to you, specifically in best ball, because you actually don't, in a weird way, you don't want that like round 12 guy. I don't mean don't want. It's not as impactful that you get that round 12 guy that just like is a smash, right? Like if Kyron was going in round 12 and did what Kyron did, of course you would want to have him. He would be super valuable. But the fact that he was like only picked in 25% of drafts is actually better for you because he was in the last round. Then he also got hurt in the middle of the season, right? But I'm sure everybody remembers thinking about whether you're going to add Royce Freeman or Zach Evans or Ronnie Rivers or whatever to your fantasy teams. There's this element of randomness that once you can accept that fact, it's actually, to me, the easiest way to win. it's not the easiest way to predict how you're going to win, but it's the easiest way to win, because if I draft a collection of 0 running back teams with a collection of all these running backs, I know some of them are going to hit. It's a certainty. I don't know if I'm going to get them all on the same team. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I know they're going to hit. And like, there's no other structure that allows me to do that, and also gives me like that mega ceiling that you outlined at the very beginning when we first started talking.
And it really is. I mean, this really was the perfect season for 0 RB in so many ways, because you had a lot of different types of outcomes that we can then point to and be like, this is the kind of thing that can happen. This is the kind of thing that can happen. But as you were talking, one of the things that one of the players that for some reason popped into my head was Devin Singletary, who, I mean, that's another one where Dameon Pierce is the younger back and Devin Singletary was the boring veteran backup that was like no upside because the Texans sucked. The Texans offense was good, and Dameon Pierce was so bad that Devin Singletary just basically was the better player for them. They decided that he basically beat out Dameon Pierce down the stretch. He was the guy just playing over Pierce. He wasn't like a massive hit in any kind of way, but there's a lot. I mean, go back to the early season production. Another name that popped in my head was Zach Moss. I know he wasn't drafted in a ton of leagues, but you had Jonathan Taylor banged up, and Zach Moss for a stretch was really valuable early. There, the Kyron Williams thing, the obviously major injuries like the J.K. Dobbins and Nick Chubb, and how that opened up some production in those offenses. You had a lot of different types of the Raheem Mostert, a very uncertain backfield, but we knew the offense was probably going to be pretty good. Most people I knew were getting exposure to some Miami running backs. They probably all should have been going a little bit higher. Mostert ends up scoring 21 touchdowns. I mean, he ties for the NFL lead with 21 touchdowns, has a monster season, and was incredibly cheap. Anyone who had, a build that had Raheem Mostert on it did very well as a result of that. One of the last things I want to say is people do their own research on 0 RB. As you were talking through how guys can be quiet all year and then explode for stretches, it reminded me that I always see the research where people look at full season points. That is not how these things impact fantasy. Mm-hmm. Running back, especially, we talked about this earlier, but it's the whole idea of like one running back usually gets the majority of the touches, sometimes two. And at receiver, multiple receivers run routes. And so there are always going to be like a wide receiver 30 or something in a given year who wasn't actually good, but played 17 games, was the wide receiver 3 on his team and had a couple decent games and basically never was impactful, but never had really like 0-point games, never had like nothing. Every week was scoring like 8 points all year or whatever it was. Maybe he's not wide receiver 30. Maybe he's a little bit of a different, but those 8 points every week aren't cracking your lineup most of the time. And if they are, it means your team sucks, basically. Like there's been some good, I can't remember who did this research on Darrell Williams a few years ago, where it was like the more points you took from him, the worse your team was. You didn't want to be playing him. And so
even though he was giving you usable weeks, right? It was actually not helping you.
It was not helping you. And so there's those types of receivers where it's like, yeah, they're going to, because more receivers are out there on the field, they're going to score points over the course of a year, accumulate points. And then when people look at the end of the year, they go, well, I do see some names that are like in here that were later round picks or this or that. And it's like, well, at receiver, you want to look at where did the real spikes come from? Who has the ability to put up spike weeks, monster weeks, especially in best ball? And at running back, you want to look at the same thing. The difference is when you get those from whoever, you gave some great examples, Rashad Penny in past years. If you go look at the final end of season numbers that year, Rashad Penny was one of the most valuable players that season, period. Full stop.
Yeah.
And maybe the most, right.
Yeah. Amon-Ra, it's like him and Amon-Ra, who also didn't do shit all season. But yeah, for best ball, I think I might make the case Rashad Penny was the most valuable player in best ball that year, and he played like 4 games.
And if you go look at his overall scoring, it's like whatever, running back 40 or something like that, because it was mostly zeros until it was 25s. Mm-hmm. And that's the point I'm trying to make is when you go look at the stuff, a lot of people make this mistake in the offseason. They go look at the full season numbers. They go, well, the only running backs who got all these points were actually, drafted relatively highly. There are all these guys that played 17 games as a lead back on their offense. That doesn't mean they were the most valuable running backs necessarily. I mean, the very top one is going to be Christian McCaffrey is the most valuable right? But once you get down to about wide receiver, or I mean, running back 6, especially once you get down to about running back 10, and you're looking at guys who basically just stayed healthy and racked up a lot of touches, as opposed to, really having extremely strong spike weeks throughout. Anyway, the point I'm just trying to make is it's more about the per game scoring, right? And the fact that these running backs that have the spike weeks are very, very important. You should be able to draft a build where you have like the Jaylen Warrens that can give you the floor throughout, and then you can take zeros from these other dudes, and then when they spike to 25 points, that's getting into your lineup, and that's this whole idea of a Frankenstein running back build that can actually mirror some of the highest scoring running backs. Anyway, it's just a word of caution in terms of how to research this stuff in the offseason.
Yeah, I love it. It's a project that I want to work on. I know, like you said, you've done some stuff with Frankenstein. Other people have definitely done some stuff. I just want to think about it some more. Is like what we just said, like I know inherently, we just talked about it for 20 minutes about like, Rashad, we just outlined that Rashad Penny played like 4 games the whole season and was arguably the most valuable player in all of fantasy that year. So we're clearly understanding the concept of it's not just about how many total points you score. It's not even about how many games you play. It's when you're out there relative to cost, of course. But when you're out there, when you are the guy, right? Rashad Penny technically played, I think, week 1 that year or something like that. But anyway, when you're producing, are you producing 8 points or are you producing 25 points? Because I'll take a bunch of zeros to get me those 3 or 4 25-point games. I don't give a shit about the rest of it. And the 8 points all year do me no good, right? Now, obviously, most players are somewhere in between all of that. But figuring out how to approach that is why the market is bad at evaluating running backs, is because it's hard. I don't have it nailed down either, but conceptually, I think that's probably like the linchpin of all of this is thinking of, like, I think Zero RB was originally thinking about the game in a different way than everybody else was thinking about it, to tie it all back to what we were talking about at the beginning. And that's the concept we're talking about here, is within the framework of zero, and this isn't just applicable to zero running back, modified zero running back or modified double anchor or whatever the hell we want to call any of those structures. It applies to all that, but taking these principles and like thinking them through as to how they specifically relate to this game and how like our opponents are not thinking about them this way. Like no, James Conner's a bad example because I don't necessarily think like he's a bad pick or whatever. Mike Davises from a couple years ago, for anybody that remembers, when he goes to the Falcons, are always going to go ahead of the Rashad Pennies. And we have to, I'm not saying he shouldn't, I don't want to get into a debate about price exactly, but we have to figure out how to appropriately value those guys. And I just think being directionally accurate on our evaluation of that, because of these zero RB principles, is like the fucking edge, dude. Just like being able to think about it that way is such a big edge.
And the thing about the Mike Davis is, and I wrote about this when I wrote about the Frankenstein running back stuff last year, but this is the way that I'm increasingly thinking about it and trying to teach it, I guess, is, and we'll bury it 75 minutes into a pod because, why not?
That's what I do every episode. So right, just add it to the list.
I think people want to believe they can find the running back. And you understand why. You look at last year, you want to find the Christian McCaffrey, or you want to find the Kyron Williams, who didn't play every game, but when he was out there, you could count on him every week for points. And the feeling is, I need to find the answer, that player that's in my lineup all year long, that's the star. And it's the same thing you're looking for with the breakout superstar tight end, the obviously elite receivers you're looking for, the quarterback who defines the season, whether that's, Jalen Hurts a couple years ago or whatever. That's not the goal at running back. You shouldn't ever expect, and in fact, almost should know that it's not going to happen at running back. There's like a couple each year that do produce all year long. It's like McCaffrey and like a couple others, but even the ones that are really, really good usually miss a little bit of time, or they go through down spells or what have you. You should think about it in terms of, how do I get production out of my RB1 and my RB2 spots? And it has to be from different names throughout the year. It's not the same player every single week. People always overvalue touches, guaranteed touches, the Mike Davis example that you just gave, because they think, I'm going to have this amount of production in this spot all year long. And it's not the way the running back position actually works. It's not the way it ever plays out. You don't have that warm comfort of guaranteed touches. You can't find answers in draft season or in week 1 if you're picking up players on waivers, or week 2 or week 3 for week 17 running back. You just can't. It's not, you can't set it and forget it at the running back position. You should expect volatility all season. It's who's my running back 1 now, who's my running back 1 later, who's going to be my running back 1 in between. And in best ball, we get the advantage of not having to pick starts and sits. And so you play it through the spike weeks, but you're building for weekly upside more so than, guaranteed Mike Davis is going into my lineup now for the whole season. I have these guaranteed touches. That's the difference between the Mike Davis and Rashad Penny point. Rashad Penny drafters were like, if and when this guy's healthy and on the field, I know he has 30-point upside. Mike Davis drafters were like, I have a guy that I can plug in at my RB2 spot all year. And that's just not a way to solve for running back in fantasy.
I love. I've stolen a lot of your catchphrases. You have a good way of summarizing different things, but I'm absolutely stealing the. You can't plan your week 17 running backs in week 1. That is such a good way to put it, and so true, and exactly the point of all of this. And I will add, adding on to that is that it's because this is not a prediction game. And everything that you just outlined, right? The person, I want to find that running back. Everybody thinks I can find Kyron. I can find that next Kyron. And it's like, you find Kyron by not trying to find Kyron. As stupid as that sounds, because you're building out something from a theoretical, right? Zero running back is a concept, and I'm going to put together this collection, and I'm going to do it over a bunch of teams. And like, look, I drafted one successful zero running back team all last year. I drafted like damn near 1,000 best ball teams last year. I showed one today, right? Because there's a lot of bad ones, like a lot of really bad ones. But that's just like this game. You're not trying to out predict everybody. You're actually trying to like out game theory them. And one way of doing it is the idea that Ben just said. I'm not trying to play in my week 17 running backs in week 1. I'm trying to put a collection together that's going to navigate me through this gauntlet of a game in hopes that, because of the archetypes that I drafted and obviously with the wide receivers and all that kind of stuff, I'm going to then have the best chance of having these guys in week 17 that it falls together to me, right? When I get lucky, what happens? And that's monster upside in the best ball finals, because I just drafted this structural thing and I didn't try to get everything right at the draft.
Yep.
All right. Well, you are in a little bit of a mini vacation, picking up a bunch of cardio, getting in shape. But the people probably do want to know. I did see, I believe you just posted something right before we started recording. I haven't read it yet. Obviously, some targets for route run stuff, which is right up my alley. I enjoy, but I am interested. I am selfishly interested, as I'm sure the people are. What's the plan for stealing signals? What's the plan for ship chasing, stealing bananas, all that fun stuff?
We've been taking a little bit of time on each of those different platforms. We're doing stealing. We're doing ship chasing this week. We'll be back on Thursday night. I believe we're doing stealing bananas this week as well. Sean and I just been kind of crossing paths the last couple of weeks as we've been trying to ramp it back up. The pods will be coming back soon. Stealing signal stuff. I've been writing a little bit, some theory stuff, still like recap from 2023. Those target spot run articles you talked about. I mean, I like to use target spot run as sort of my foundational stat, and then add in all of the relevant context kind of as I talk through that, how there's all this, unexplained variance with basically any stat we can use. I like to start with target spot run and then try to analyze the unexplained variance, essentially, which is basically everything outside of what, people like to talk about that fancy R squared numbers. What are the best stats that have the best R squareds? But none of them are going to capture the whole picture in football. Obviously, I write stealing signals in season on a weekly basis, watch it basically every single game. I say basically, I don't miss games. I always think it's weird to be like, yeah, I watched every game, like that's some brag, but I it's like bad for my health, how obsessed I am about that and the stealing signals product. And so it's good in the off season to provide the context, I think, around the numbers and those things. That Targets Per Out Run series has been one of my most successful in the early off season the last couple of years. I've really hit on a lot of key names accurately, and something I'm most proud of. So I started doing that. Like you said, sent the first one out, just 2 of the divisions. It's going to be 4 different posts, pretty in depth, breaking down basically all the wide receivers and tight ends in the league. You were talking about this isn't a prediction game when we talk about the running backs. And I was thinking in my head, if you want to be in the prediction game, do what I do, which is try to predict the wide receiver, tight end position, quarterback position, offenses, that kind of stuff. I think you can actually try to predict. And we have evidence over the years that there's stuff that is more relevant and more skill-based for pass catchers. And anyway, that's what I'm doing a lot of in these pieces, is talking through the positions that are a little bit easier to predict. The way I would describe it is where guys are at in their careers. For the veterans, are they starting to fall off? Are their peripherals starting to wane? For the young guys, what have they shown in terms of, breakout ability and those types of things? So that's a fun one to dig into for me from an analyst perspective in the early offseason every year. And that's the big project right now over Stealing Signals.
I love it. I have, like I said, I steal a lot of phrases from Ben. I also stole some of that process and put it into play this year, specifically around my rookie kind of analysis. This wide receiver rookie class is it's a doozy. Everybody, if you're listening to this, you probably know that a really, really loaded class, but I found it a ton of fun to do kind of what you just outlined with this rookie class and dig in. And I started with from a targets per route run perspective. That was my baseline, digging into all of these guys. And then you're Frankenstein. Then I start Frankensteining in all the context and additional data and, all that kind of stuff, because I really like, I enjoy college. Like, I enjoy college football much more than the NFL, like as a product, sitting down and watching it. I think because I get to just be more of a fan and just gamble on it, of course. But I used to be kind of like a film bro or whatever. Like, I just love football. Like, I enjoy watching it and breaking some things down. I played defensive back, so I particularly love watching like DBs versus wide receiver type stuff. And so, but I think it broke my process a little bit. I was getting away from the core of really, like, I was falling into the prediction game type of thing too much from the wrong direction. And so anyway, taking some of the baseline of what Ben does through his evaluation, I tried to do a lot of that with the rookies this year, and I'm pretty excited for how it turns out. So we'll see. I mean, next year when Malik Washington sucks, I'm going to blame Ben, and I'm going to go back to the old process is the plan here. But we'll get out. We got to get out of here. Ben's got some more cardio to go do, as do I. We're getting old and trying to get into shape. But obviously, you guys know where to find him. Go check out Chip Chasing and all of that fun stuff. And we'll see you next time. Peace.
Woo! Those were some spicy takes. Want to stay up to date with all of the other spicy takes we're going to have over here at Spike Week? Why don't you press that subscribe button below? You turn notifications on, we draft a team, boom, you know about it. We have another spicy take, boom, you know about it. You can be there, you can draft with us. You want to stay up to date? That's how you do it. All right, we'll catch you later next time here at Spike Week.